Yes, my name is Jesse Hancock and I'm appearing on behalf of United Voice today.
Thank you.
So I just want to start by saying thank you again for this opportunity and thank you for all the work that you have put into the draft report. Made for some light Christmas reading. I'm Jesse Hancock. I've been a member of United Voice for about 6 years now. I currently work in the NGO sector. And I'm a very proud union member and firmly believe in collective action and the ability to organise in the workplace and community to create the kind of society that we want to live in. United Voice members in the NT come from a diverse range of industries and backgrounds. These industries include hospitality, health and aged care, mining, manufacturing, children's services and property services. I would like to draw the panel's attention to information that is available on the United Voice national website in relation to what the union stands for. And I quote, "Nationally, United Voice is an organisation of over 120,000 Australian workers, united by our belief in the dignity of workers and the right to a fair and just treatment at work. We are an active union and we are passionate about organising to win. We have diverse backgrounds and a multitude of different skills, but we have the same goal: to be agents of positive social change and to continuously stand up for the type of society we believe in. Many of us work on a casual or part-time basis, 60% of us are women, and half of us are from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. It is from this diversity that we gain strength." I wanted to highlight this before going further to give context to the position that United Voice has taken in supporting the moratorium and standing against onshore shale gas fracking in the NT, and to acknowledge some of the questions that were put to United Voice at a previous inquiry hearing here in Darwin. In consultation with members, United Voice arrived at its position on the issue of fracking by taking into account what is best for the NT and its communities as a whole. Whilst the conditions and availability of work play a significant role in determining this position, that is not the only factor taken into account. Quality of life for workers and their community is also a key consideration. United Voice does not support the extractive mining industry based purely on the arguable, and I will go into greater detail later, but the arguable potential for job creation, but rather on whether or not the introduction of this sector would be good for communities and the work in which they choose to be involved. Even if United Voice were to consider the onshore shale gas fracking industry to have a positive influence on the NT, the documented research to date highlights the low probability of jobs and the overall lack of economic viability of this sector. And I want to go into some greater depth there now. So in United Voice's prior submission to the fracking inquiry, it was outlined that we do not hold a strong belief in the projections for job creation. Since that time, ASIL Allen has released its economic impact report, and our concerns were very much recognised through this study. The panel also asked about what other avenues the Territory does have for job growth, and I felt inferred that mining was one of the only ways forward. In this section I will also speak to this. As has been highlighted through other submissions, in particular the Australia Institute, the figures that were outlined in the ASIL Allen report could have been more accurately reflected in the draft recommendations. There was somewhat of a disconnect between those two documents. ASIL Allen's economic impact reports clearly states that there is a very high likelihood that the shale gas industry is not viable in the NT. That is, that after exploration, there is a very low likelihood for the shale gas industry to be able to get to a point of actively producing and selling gas, the most likely scenario that they predict. It is important that the draft inquiry report highlights this fact very clearly and in accessible language for all those reading it and relying upon it to make decisions of significant consequence. Whilst United Voice acknowledges that the risks of onshore shale gas fracking can be mitigated through robust policy and regulation, I want to stress the point that the risk cannot be mitigated away entirely. This point is also established in the draft final report. Decision makers need to be very aware that should they lift the moratorium, they are exposing Territorians to this risk in pursuit of an outcome that has already been labelled as highly unlikely to succeed. The other point that needs clarifying is that in lifting the moratorium, they are also not going to create thousands of jobs that have been so vigorously promoted in the draft report and subsequently in the media by both journalists and the inquiry itself. As the union that represents mining workers, of course job creation is important. But as stated in the ASIL Allen report, the most likely outcome of lifting the moratorium would just be an additional 5 full-time equivalent jobs per year. I note that this is both direct and indirect forms of employment. The previous presenter pointed out very clearly that jobs will also come and they will go. They're not long-term, local, stable jobs, and that is what fosters a better community. Even based on Aisel Allen's most optimistic scenario, the total job creation over a 25-year period, based on 524 additional jobs per year, the final jobs figure in the NT would be greater of less than half of 1%. Another consideration in relation to job creation is the impact that fracking could have on other sectors. The inquiry has had many submissions highlighting the danger that fracking poses to the tourism sector. Based on information sourced from NT budget papers, the two job categories of accommodation and food services, as well as retail trade, together create just under 5 times the amount of jobs that the entire mining industry currently is responsible for in the NT. Now, whilst not all these jobs can be attributed to tourism, I share this as an example of the adverse impact fracking could have on jobs in other sectors, and to highlight that on a larger scale, mining in the NT is not and will not, under the projections provided, ever be a source of major employment in the NT. As a union that also covers hospitality workers, this is a point of concern for United Voice, and one that should be taken seriously by the panel. As well as these sectors I have just mentioned, the impact that mining has on agricultural jobs has become well documented. In Queensland, for every 10 coal seam gas jobs that were created, 18 agricultural jobs were lost. And for the mining jobs that are created, filling the positions with local workers is yet another challenge. Given the decrease in national mining employment figures, there are many skilled workers looking for work and ready to move interstate to find work or be part of a FIFO workforce. A further condition that could be added to the current recommendations could be mining companies having to put aside capital specifically for training local people in order that they can fill the more highly skilled positions, particularly during the construction phase. Part of this would include a condition of having demonstrated that every effort has been taken to employ and train a local workforce prior to taking on interstate workers or a FIFO work model. I want to move on to talk a bit about health risks to workers. Outlined in the draft report is the fact that the risks associated to on-site workers in the shale gas fracking industry will be considerably higher than the risk posed to the general public and collective community. And I take from the report this quote, the exposure pathways that can result in broad community exposure are likely to be quite different to those by which on-site workers, that is occupational exposure, might occur. The magnitude of such exposure and the consequent health risks are likely to be higher for workers who are directly handling these chemicals or are exposed to greater doses as a result of their proximity over the longer term to the construction, drilling and gas extraction activities. The terms of reference of this inquiry focus on the potential impacts of hydraulic fracturing activity on the general community of the NT. Managing the risks associated with on-site occupational exposures are considered to be industry responsibilities and beyond the scope of this inquiry. As a union that represents mining workers, United Voice has considerable concern that the inquiry does not interpret the scope of the inquiry to cover recommendations to ensure safety for workers involved in this industry. United Voice is very much aware that the conditions under which people work impact significantly on the health of the community in which they live and the well-being of both themselves as individuals as well as their families. Given the mistrust of the extractive mining industry that has been clearly evidenced throughout this inquiry, United Voice would strongly assert that it is within the scope and responsibility of the inquiry to recommend regulatory reform to adequately protect workers in the NT. These recommendations should be aimed at ensuring safe and well communities with minimised health risks from the onshore shale gas fracking industry. Before examining the current protections for workers and where there are shortfalls, it is important to highlight just how unsafe the onshore shale gas fracking industry is for workers. Based on evidence from fracking in the US, accidents involving workers are almost inevitable. The 4 most common causes of accidents are firstly vehicle accidents. There are a huge number of vehicle movements involved in fracking just one well. Particularly on some of the roads in the NT, this is a significant safety concern. I note that during exploration fracking in Central Australia prior to the moratorium being put in place, residents from Central Australia were quick to raise concerns of the cowboy culture on remote roads in country areas, which had already resulted in minor accidents and chemical spills in a short period of time. And that was 2 chemical spills on the Plenty Highway, about 300 kilometres northeast of Alice Springs. Secondly, breathing silica dust, which can lead to lung cancer and silicosis. Silicosis can take 10 to 15 years to present symptoms, but once it has, it is incurable. Thirdly, explosions and fires. There are many risks for fire and explosion during a fracking operation, particularly during the final stage of well completion, when small explosions are detonated to create a fracture. There are many recorded incidents of fires and explosions, including one as recently as January the 23rd in Oklahoma, where an explosion and fire at an oil and gas drilling site has resulted in injuries and 5 fatalities of workers. Lastly, exposure to chemicals. There are a huge number of chemicals, as you know, involved in fracking. Many of these we do not have information on, as they are not able to be released to the public. An example of one that is very well known and documented would be hydrogen sulfide, that is present at drilling sites as a byproduct of the natural gas being produced. According to the Bureau of Labour Statistics, exposure to hydrogen sulfide was responsible for 60 deaths over a 10-year period from 2001 to 2010. Exposure to chemicals is a good example of the dangers of leaving workplace safety and regulation to the responsibility of the industry, as is recommended in this draft report. Despite ongoing advice from the US workplace safety regulator to control exposure limits to chemicals such as hydrogen sulfide, there has been a strong pushback from the gas lobby, the American Petroleum Institute, and workers have continued to be exposed to levels of hydrogen sulfide that can be 10 times that of the recommended maximum exposure. These risks and accidents are all well documented. All the safety risks that are classified as low or non-existent to the community in the draft report due to incomplete paths and mitigation measures could easily be classified as a high risk with a high likelihood for workers, and as having a very clear and direct complete path to on-site workers. So in 2015, under the Giles government, there were significant changes made to workers' rehabilitation and compensation legislation in the NT. These changes have resulted in less protection for workers and more limited rights. Just some examples of these changes include compensation payments limited to 260 weeks, limited access to compensation based on a 15% whole person impairment, discontinuation of journey claims, and capped compensation payments. The result of these changes have been negative for both workers as well as the public purse. For example, limiting workers to just 260 weeks of compensation will mean that workers who are in need of ongoing support and rehabilitation due to a workplace injury or illness will be pushed into the public health system and away from the private insurers that were previously covering costs. This is a shift that will cost the public more and put further strain on the Medicare system. In relation to the workers themselves and how these changes have negatively impacted upon them, there are some key areas of concern given the highly risky nature of the shale gas industry. Under current legislation, workers have access to ongoing compensation only if their injury is classified as greater than 15% of whole person impairment. In reviewing the current compensation scheme, the Law Society of Northern Territory stated that for an injury to classify as 15% whole person impairment or more, it would have to be close to catastrophic. Bearing this in mind, any injury sustained that is not almost catastrophic, but may be ongoing, will only allow the worker to access compensation for a limited period of time. Looking closer at figures in relation to worker injuries, it is reported that per annum there are 3.3 non-fatal injuries per 100 full-time jobs when drilling gas wells. And this reference does note that many incidents go unreported. On examining the nature of these incidents, the highest of that being transport incidents and then explosions or coming into contact with dangerous objects, it is clear that there will be many injuries that need ongoing rehabilitation, but that are less than a 15% whole person impairment. Once again, this is low protection to workers at a high cost to the public. The statistics highlighting accidents that have led to fatalities are even more astounding. The BLS has found that the rate of fatal accidents are 7 times higher in the gas and oil extraction industry than all other employment in the US. The changes to NT Workers' Comp in 2015 now mean that for a family or spouse to lodge a death claim, they have to be able to prove that the employer or third party were at fault in causing the death. This is a shift away from the no-fault scheme that was previously in place. It can become very difficult and expensive to prove fault of an injury or death. In these instances, in most cases, the individual is far less resourced and able to provide proof than the employer. This is particularly concerning given the recorded issues that unions have had in accessing drilling sites in the UK and the unfair targeting that safety-conscious workers have experienced in terms of trying to find employment or more hours on a drilling worksite. I share evidence from the UK as the access and union structure there is similar to that of Australia. And having previously worked for a union, I would also offer that employers who make it difficult for unions to speak to employees are generally the employers with the most to hide. As the inquiry will be aware, having visited large chunks of the NT, there are great distances to be travelled. Not only are there great distances, but also roads that are not always kept in good condition, severe weather events, and very active wildlife. Under current legislation, those workers who are not flying directly into sites, will be travelling in these dangerous conditions to drilling sites or staging areas. Unless having taken out their own private insurance policy, they do not currently have journey cover on the way to and from work. And this could mean that if they were to have an accident that prevented them from working for a period of time, their employer would not be obligated to cover costs and continue providing some form of salary. This would result in workers relying on what little sick leave they may have accrued and then on whatever savings or government assistance they may be able to procure. I also note that the government's regulatory body in the NT WorkSafe, have only prosecuted 6 cases since 2012. This is not indicative of the highly stringent and active regulatory body that is needed to regulate and monitor risky industry. This body should be one that is proactively seeking to ensure the highest of safety standards and holding companies to account on protecting their workers and compensating them for their injuries. In concluding, in this submission I've tried to capture some of United Voice's key concerns with the onshore shale gas fracking industry. I've largely focused on concern to workers' rights and the misleading job figures that have been in circulation. Whilst this submission has not touched on environmental concerns, these issues have been raised, that is, environmental issues have been raised by United Voice in a previous submission, and we stand by them as very much a part of why we oppose shale gas fracking. As outlined, United Voice is a broad union and a union that strives to better society. There is strong evidence that there will not be significant growth in employment opportunities if the moratorium were to be lifted. I have also put forward a case that were the moratorium to be lifted, current workers' rights and compensation laws are not suitable in the NT to expose workers to such a risky and accident-prone industry. The draft report and its recommendations acknowledge that there is a widespread mistrust of the extractive mining industry. This mistrust is particularly high in the NT. At the same time that the panel has acknowledged this, you have also placed responsibility on these mistrusted industries to protect the workers they employ, and this does not add up. United Voice recognises that there is always considerable responsibility on employers to mitigate risk to the extent that they can. But being the first call for many injured workers, United Voice is also acutely aware that accidents will happen and that oftentimes they could have been avoided. The inquiry has a responsibility to include recommendations that mitigate risk to the community. The workplace and the workers are very much part of a community. If workers do not feel safe, if injured workers are not adequately compensated, and if the government is not doing everything in its capacity to promote a safe workplace, then there are adverse impacts on both the physical and mental health of the NT communities. As such, United Voice would push for recommendations to be included aiming at reforming the NT Workers Rehabilitation and Compensation Act, and creating a robust OH&S regulatory body which could include increased funding and operational ability for NT WorkSafe to prosecute companies that are not being responsible employers. These recommendations would need to be implemented prior to the moratorium being lifted, and exploration should not commence without these amendments being made. United Voice's position is not one against mining. United Voice has come to its position based on the need for safe workplaces, adequate government regulation and protection for workers, and in support of not spending significant amounts of public money on an industry that will employ few locals and have limited benefits for communities.
Thank you very much. Questions? Yes, Professor Hart.
I just had a clarification point. The situation with chemicals, we have recommended that all chemicals used and produced in the shale gas fracking industry should be publicly disclosed. So that's not only the ones that are used for fracturing, but also the ones that come up from the shale deposits.
Yes, yep. My point was more that accidents that have been happening to workers, we don't know the full detail because a lot of the chemicals that they have been exposed to at this stage haven't been put out to the public.
Well, it's a recommendation that we've expressly made.
Yes, and a good recommendation.
Any further questions? Yes, Dr. Beck.
Thanks for your presentation, and I note your genuine concern for the protection of workers. And as you would acknowledge that workplaces in general are potentially risky areas, and particularly in areas such as construction sites and mining sites. So I'm just wondering, have you done any comparative analysis of the injury fatality rates associated with the shale gas industry and compared it with similar rates in other industries?
No,
Such as mining, for example.
Yeah, no, I haven't. The research I did didn't have those figures or comparisons there, but it's something we can certainly look into.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think you might have, and again, I may have misheard you. I was scribbling down some other notes at the time, but you started off your presentation, I think, with a quote from the Allen report about the commercial viability of this industry. Is that
Yep.
is that right?
That's correct, yep.
Could you please give me the page reference of that quote?
I don't know, the reference was to their matrix, the 5 different scenarios with 3 columns of the likelihood of each outcome.
Oh, so it wasn't a direct quote from the actual report itself?
No, I didn't include any quotes. I used the figures there that the high likelihood outcome was the shale breeze, is that correct, the lowest one? And that has an outcome of 5 additional full-time equivalent jobs per year.
Right, so that was just a reference to the breeze, that's all?
Yes.
All right, sorry, I obviously did misunderstand you.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation.